Millionaire CEO's rules were emphatically clear: no black curvy women, until she walked in. Harrison Blackwell's empire was built on one unbreakable rule, until Dr. Amara Williams stepped into his Seattle boardroom with a solution that could save his company and destroy everything he thought he believed about power, control, and the dangerous territory of his own heart. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Once again, you're welcome to Mr. Paul's Stories, where we weave our dreams and hearts together through the magic of stories. Now, let's begin today's story. The 42nd floor of Blackwell Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a steel and glass monument to ambition, its corner office offering Harrison Blackwell a god's-eye view of the city that had made him. At 38, he commanded a business empire worth $3 billion, every decision filtered through decades of calculated control. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across his mahogany desk as he reviewed the latest quarterly reports, his gray eyes scanning numbers that would make most men dizzy with success. Yet satisfaction felt as distant as the Hudson River glinting far below. "Sir." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, respectful but urgent. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting. The Seattle acquisition is complicated." Harrison's jaw tightened. Complicated meant expensive. Expensive meant vulnerable. And vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not in the carefully constructed world where he determined who belonged and who didn't. What do you think shapes a person's need for absolute control? Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear your perspective. He straightened his Italian silk tie and reached for his phone, already mentally cataloging the solutions that would maintain his empire's pristine image. Some problems required surgical precision. Others demanded complete amputation. 23 years of building Blackwell Industries had taught him the difference. But as Harrison strode toward the boardroom, something gnawed at the edges of his certainty, a restlessness that even his meticulously ordered world couldn't quite suppress. Chicago, same morning. Dr. Amara Williams stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Lake Shore Drive office, watching the morning light dance across Lake Michigan's surface. At 34, she had built her consulting firm from nothing. No connections, no inherited wealth, just relentless intelligence and the kind of determination that turned obstacles into stepping stones. Her reflection stared back from the glass, rich brown skin that glowed with health, curves that she'd learned to carry with pride rather than apology, and eyes that had seen enough corporate boardrooms to recognize both opportunity and threat at 50 paces. Today's call from Blackwell Industries could be either. "Dr. Williams?" Her assistant knocked softly. "The car service is here. Your flight to Seattle leaves in 2 hours." Amara turned from the window, her mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had made her the most sought-after corporate transformation specialist in the Midwest. Blackwell Industries was hemorrhaging money on their Seattle acquisition, a tech company whose integration had gone spectacularly wrong. They needed her expertise in organizational psychology and change management. What they probably didn't expect was her. She gathered her briefcase, checking that her presentation materials were perfect. In her world, there was no room for error. Every client meeting was a battlefield where competence was her weapon and excellence her shield. She'd learned long ago that being underestimated was actually an advantage, as long as you were prepared to prove everyone wrong. The phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Maya. "Go show those corporate dinosaurs what real power looks like. You've got this, Queen." Amara smiled, slipping the phone into her purse. Maya didn't know about the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance required to excel in spaces that weren't designed for women who looked like her. But Maya's faith felt like armor, and today she would need every piece of protection she could gather. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Amara felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with wariness. Another boardroom, another chance to prove herself, another opportunity to transform a broken system from the inside. She had no idea she was about to walk into a war she hadn't prepared for, one where the battlefield was a man's prejudices and the stakes were higher than any contract she'd ever signed. The Seattle skyline waited, shrouded in morning mist, holding secrets that would change everything. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwell Industries' Seattle headquarters like an omen, each drop exploding against the glass in patterns that mirrored the chaos brewing inside the 45th floor boardroom. Harrison had flown in from New York at dawn, his mood as dark as the Pacific Northwest sky, the quarterly reports clutched in his hand like evidence of betrayal. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter of the six-man board, "explain to me how a simple tech acquisition became a $100 million hemorrhage." Board member Stevens, a man whose nervous tics had multiplied with each failed quarter, cleared his throat. "The integration has been challenging. Cultural mismatch, productivity drops, key talent leaving." "I don't want euphemisms," Harrison snapped, his gray eyes scanning the faces around the mahogany table. "I want solutions." "We've brought in someone," interjected CFO Martinez, sliding a folder across the polished surface. "Dr. Amara Williams. She's a specialist in organizational transformation, corporate psychology. Her success rate with troubled acquisitions is unprecedented." Harrison's fingers stilled on the folder. "I don't recall approving this hire. The situation required immediate action. She's already en route from Chicago. Her track record speaks for itself. She saved Morrison Industries, turned around the Hartwell Group merger, and I decide who works for this company." The words came out with the kind of controlled fury that had built his empire, each syllable precise as a scalpel cut. "What's her background?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "PhD in organizational psychology from Northwestern, MBA from Wharton, 15 years of consulting experience. She's expensive, but that's not what I'm asking." Harrison's voice dropped to the tone that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "What does she look like?" The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Martinez opened his mouth, then closed it, understanding suddenly why their CEO's face had gone rigid with something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Sir," Stevens whispered, she's exactly what you said we couldn't." The boardroom doors swept open with the quiet authority of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. Dr. Amara Williams stepped into the space like she was claiming territory, her presence filling the room before she'd spoken a single word. She wore a tailored navy suit that hugged her curves with unapologetic confidence, her natural hair styled in a crown of coils that caught the fluorescent light like a halo of defiance. Harrison's world tilted. She was everything his rules had been designed to keep out: black, beautiful, and utterly unintimidated by the wall of masculine power staring at her from around the conference table. Her brown eyes swept the room with a kind of assessment that turned observers into the observed, and when her gaze landed on Harrison, something electric sparked in the space between them. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the smoky warmth of confidence earned through fire, "I'm Dr. Amara Williams. I understand you have a problem that needs solving." Harrison couldn't breathe, couldn't think. For 23 years, he had maintained absolute control over who entered his world, who sat at his tables, who earned the right to challenge his authority. His rules weren't just business practices, they were survival mechanisms, walls built from childhood lessons about power and place and the dangerous consequences of letting the wrong people get too close. And now she stood in his boardroom like those walls had never existed. "Dr. Williams," he managed, his voice rougher than intended, "there seems to have been a miscommunication. We're not currently accepting new consultants." She tilted her head slightly, and Harrison caught the flash of something sharp in her eyes. Not hurt, not surprise, but recognition. She knew exactly what this was. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume?" Her tone remained professionally pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "I flew here at your board's urgent request. My preliminary analysis suggests your Seattle acquisition is failing because you're trying to force an innovative, collaborative tech culture into a rigid corporate hierarchy. The mismatch is costing you approximately $2 million per week." "We'll handle it internally," Harrison said, even as his mind registered the accuracy of her assessment. Everything about her radiated competence, from the way she held her briefcase to the subtle confidence in her posture. She belonged here more than most of the men in this room. That terrified him. "Of course," Amara replied smoothly, but her eyes never left his face. "Though I should mention that your competitors are circling. Morrison Tech made an offer to your top 3 developers yesterday. They'll likely accept unless the work environment changes dramatically within the next 48 hours. The boardroom fell silent except for the rain's relentless percussion against the windows. Harrison felt the walls of his carefully constructed world pressing in from all sides. She was offering him salvation wrapped in everything he'd spent decades avoiding. "How do you know about Morrison's offer?" Stevens asked weakly. Amara's smile was professional perfection. "Because they tried to hire me first. I told them I don't work for companies that prey on others' failures when the problems are easily solvable." Her gaze returned to Harrison. "I prefer transformation to destruction." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Harrison realized with crystalline clarity that this woman represented more than a business decision. She was a reckoning, with his rules, his fears, and the empire he'd built on foundations that suddenly felt as fragile as the rain-streaked glass surrounding them. His phone buzzed with a text that made his blood freeze. Morrison just poached Williams, Chun, and Rodriguez. They're announcing the new hires Monday. Stevens. Harrison looked up to find Amara watching him with knowing eyes, as if she could read the message from across the room. 48 hours, Mr. Blackwell, she said quietly. That's how long you have before your acquisition becomes their acquisition. The question is, are your rules more important than your company? She turned toward the door, her movement fluid and final, and Harrison felt something crack inside his chest, not just his control, but something deeper. Something that had been locked away so long he'd forgotten it existed. Dr. Williams. The words left his mouth before his mind could stop them. She paused, her hand on the door handle, waiting. "We'll need a full assessment," he heard himself say, each word feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Complete organizational analysis. 48-hour turnaround." When she turned back, her smile was different, warmer, genuine, with just a hint of triumph that she tried to hide. "I'll start immediately." As the door closed behind her, Harrison sank into his chair, his hands trembling with something that felt dangerously like hope and terror braided together. Around the table, his board members stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. "Sir," Martinez said carefully, "are you sure about this?" Harrison's eyes fixed on the door through which she disappeared, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. "No," he whispered. "I'm not sure about anything anymore." What do you think happens when we're forced to choose between our fears and our survival? Share your thoughts below. I'm curious about your perspective on moments that change everything. The rain continued its assault on the windows, washing the city clean while inside, two people began the dangerous work of washing away the walls that had kept them apart. The silence in Harrison's corner office felt heavy enough to shatter glass. 24 hours had passed since Dr. Amara Williams had walked into his boardroom and systematically dismantled every assumption he'd built his empire on. 24 hours since she'd presented a solution so brilliant, so precisely crafted, that even his most skeptical board members had leaned forward with hungry interest. 24 hours since his world had tilted off its axis. Harrison stood at his window overlooking Elliott Bay, watching ferries cut white paths through the gray water. Seattle's skyline stretched before him, a city he'd chosen for this headquarters precisely because it felt controllable, manageable. Unlike the chaos of New York or the unpredictability of Los Angeles. But control felt like sand slipping through his fingers now. "She's staying at the Four Seasons," his assistant had informed him that morning, as if Amara's location was somehow relevant to business. But Harrison found himself wondering what she ordered for breakfast, whether she'd noticed the view of the sound from her room, if she slept as restlessly as he had. The thoughts disgusted him. He pressed his palms against the cool glass, trying to center himself in the familiar rhythm of profit margins and strategic acquisitions. This was temporary insanity, a momentary lapse brought on by surprise and the pressure of the board's expectations. Dr. Williams was a consultant, nothing more. A tool to fix his Seattle problem, then disappear back to whatever Chicago corner of mediocrity had spawned her. Except she wasn't mediocre. That was the problem gnawing at his chest like a physical ache. Her presentation had been flawless, not just competent, but visionary. She'd identified integration failures his own team had missed, proposed solutions that would save him $12 million, and done it all with a kind of quiet confidence that made grown men reconsider their life choices. When she'd leaned forward during the budget discussion, her voice carrying just enough authority to make the room fall silent, Harrison had felt something shift inside him. Something dangerous. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Williams is here for your 10 o'clock. Harrison's stomach clenched. He'd scheduled this follow-up meeting to discuss implementation timelines, nothing more. A professional courtesy to keep the board satisfied while he figured out how to minimize her involvement going forward. Send her in. Amara entered wearing a navy blazer that somehow managed to be both professional and distractingly feminine, her natural hair styled in a way that framed her face like a crown. She carried herself with the same unshakable poise that had unsettled him yesterday, but Harrison caught something new in her posture, a slight stiffness that suggested she was as off balance as he felt. Good. At least he wasn't suffering alone. Dr. Williams. He didn't offer her a seat, a petty power play that felt necessary to restore some sense of hierarchy. I've reviewed your proposal. And she remained standing as well, matching his energy with calm defiance. It's adequate, but I have concerns about implementation scope. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Her proposal wasn't adequate, it was brilliant. But admitting that felt like surrendering territory he couldn't afford to lose. Amara's expression didn't change, but Harrison caught the slight tightening around her eyes. What specific concerns? Timeline. Budget allocation. Personnel integration. He moved to his desk, putting the familiar barrier between them. My team has been handling corporate restructuring for 20 years. I'm not convinced we need outside perspective on this scale. Outside perspective. She repeated the words like she was tasting poison. Is that what you're calling expertise now? The challenge in her voice made his pulse quicken, with anger or something else, he couldn't tell. I'm calling it what it is, Dr. Williams. You have impressive credentials, but Blackwell Industries operates differently than your typical clients. You mean it operates with different standards? The loaded pause before standards hit him like a slap. She knew. Somehow, she'd read between the lines of his corporate culture and seen exactly what kind of man he was. The realization should have made him defensive. Instead, it made him furious, at her perceptiveness, at his own transparency, at the way she stood there looking at him like she could see straight through to his soul. I mean it operates successfully, he said, his voice harder than he'd intended. Something I've built without needing guidance from consultants who specialize in fixing other people's problems. Amara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady on his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer but somehow more dangerous than before. Mr. Blackwell, let me be clear about something. I didn't fly to Seattle to fix you. I came here to save your company $12 million and prevent the loss of 300 jobs. If you'd rather handle that internally, that's your choice. But don't pretend this is about timelines or budgets or personnel integration. She stepped closer to his desk, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something warm and sophisticated that made his chest tighten. This is about the fact that I'm not what you expected when you called for help. And that terrifies you more than losing $12 million ever could. The words hung in the air between them like a lit fuse. Harrison felt his carefully constructed professional facade cracking, revealing the ugly truth underneath. She was right. She was absolutely devastatingly right, and he hated her for it. Dr. Williams. Save it. She gathered her briefcase with movements that were precisely controlled, but somehow spoke of barely contained emotion. I'll email you a modified proposal with reduced scope and timeline. Something more manageable for your existing team. She turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. For what it's worth, Mr. Blackwell, your Seattle acquisition is bleeding talent faster than money. The employees don't trust leadership, morale is at historic lows, and your integration timeline is 3 months behind schedule. But I'm sure your internal team can handle that with their 20 years of experience. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gunshot. Harrison sank into his chair, his hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt uncomfortably like shame. He'd won, driven her back, maintained his boundaries, preserved the careful order of his world. So why did victory taste like ashes in his mouth? His phone buzzed with a text from his father. Heard you're working with some diversity consultant on the Seattle mess. Don't let the board pressure you into compromising standards for politics. Harrison stared at the message, his father's words echoing everything he'd just said to Amara. The familiar phrases that had shaped his worldview since childhood. Standards, compromising, politics. Code words for a system that had made the Blackwell family wealthy and powerful for 3 generations. But sitting in his corner office, watching Amara's car disappear into Seattle traffic 40 floors below, those words felt like chains around his chest. Have you ever found yourself defending beliefs that no longer felt true? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes our biggest battles are with ourselves. Across town, Amara sat in her hotel room staring at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking in the empty space where her modified proposal should begin. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but inside she felt like screaming. She'd handled worse than Harrison Blackwell. Clients who questioned her credentials, who made her prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. She was used to walking into rooms where she didn't belong and making herself indispensable anyway. But something about the way he looked at her, like she was both fascinating and dangerous, had gotten under her skin in ways she couldn't afford. The worst part was the moment when his mask had slipped. For just a second, when she challenged him directly, she'd seen something raw and almost vulnerable in his gray eyes. Something that suggested Harrison Blackwell was as trapped by his prejudices as she was hurt by them. Maya's face appeared on her phone screen, a FaceTime call that Amara almost didn't answer. Hey, Queen. How'd the meeting go? Amara forced a smile. The usual. Rich white man who thinks his money makes him smarter than everyone else. But you showed him different, right? Something like that. Maya's expression grew concerned. Amara, what aren't you telling me? The question hung in the air, loaded with years of friendship and shared struggles. Amara could tell Maya about Harrison's obvious prejudice, his dismissive attitude, his determination to minimize her role. All of that would be true, but she couldn't explain the way her pulse had quickened when he'd stepped closer to his desk, or the strange hurt she'd felt when he'd called her perspective outside. She couldn't admit that for one dangerous moment, she'd wondered what it would be like to break through all that armor and find the man underneath. Nothing, she lied. Just tired of fighting the same battles. After Maya hung up, Amara returned to her laptop. The modified proposal took shape under her fingers. Professional, competent, safe. Everything Harrison Blackwell wanted. Minimal disruption, reduced timeline, limited involvement from the dangerous outside consultant who'd had the audacity to walk into his perfectly ordered world. But as she typed, Amara found herself thinking about the Seattle employees she'd interviewed yesterday. Good people caught in a failing system, watching their careers crumble while leadership played politics with their livelihoods. They deserved better than Harrison Blackwell's compromise solution. They deserved better than she was about to give them. The cursor blinked accusingly as Amara's fingers stilled on the keyboard. Outside her window, Seattle's lights twinkled like distant stars, beautiful and untouchable. Just like the possibility that she'd ever be anything more than an outside perspective, in Harrison Blackwell's carefully controlled world. The emergency call came at 3:47 a.m. Seattle time. Harrison's phone buzzed against the nightstand of his four-season suite, the harsh blue light cutting through darkness like a blade. Miami. The acquisition that was supposed to be his crown jewel, a luxury resort chain that would cement Blackwell Industries' expansion into hospitality, was imploding in real time. "Sir, we need you here immediately." His Miami operations manager's voice crackled with barely controlled panic. "The staff is threatening to strike, the investors are pulling out, and the media is calling it the biggest hospitality disaster of the decade." Within 2 hours, Harrison was airborne, his private jet cutting through pre-dawn clouds toward a crisis that could unravel everything he'd built. What he hadn't expected was to find Dr. Amara Williams already seated in the leather chair across from him, her laptop open, fingers flying across keys with surgical precision. "What is she doing here?" The words escaped before he could stop them, sharp enough to cut glass. Amara looked up, her expression coolly professional despite the 5 a.m. departure. "The board called me directly. Apparently, when your empire is burning, they want the best crisis management consultant available." She returned to her screen, dismissing him with elegant efficiency. "I'll stay out of your way if you stay out of mine." The 6-hour flight stretched between them like a minefield. Harrison tried to focus on financial reports, but found himself stealing glances at the woman who seemed utterly unbothered by his presence. She worked with a kind of focused intensity he recognized in himself, the relentless drive of someone who had earned every victory through sheer force of will. Somewhere over Texas, turbulence hit. "Jesus," Harrison muttered as his coffee sloshed, staining the pristine contract he'd been reviewing. Without looking up, Amara handed him a napkin. "Turbulence always hits over Texas. Something about the heat patterns." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but when their fingers brushed in the exchange, she pulled back as if burned. "You fly this route often?" he found himself asking. "Often enough." She closed her laptop, finally meeting his eyes. "Crisis management doesn't keep bankers' hours, Mr. Blackwell. When companies are bleeding money, geography becomes irrelevant." The plane bucked again, and this time Amara's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. Her knuckles went white against the armrest. "Bad flyer?" Harrison asked, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Bad experiences with things I can't control." The admission hung between them, more personal than anything they'd shared. When they landed in Miami's humid embrace, the crisis hit them like a physical force. The Blackwell Miami Resort, a stunning Art Deco masterpiece overlooking Biscayne Bay, was surrounded by news vans, protesters, and enough chaos to fuel a month of tabloid headlines. "Mr. Blackwell." Reporters surged forward as their car pulled up. "Is it true that staff are being denied basic benefits? What about the allegations of discriminatory hiring practices? How do you respond to workers saying they're being treated like?" Harrison's security team created a corridor, but the questions followed them like weapons. Inside the marble lobby that should have been his triumph, chaos reigned. Staff huddled in corners, guests demanded refunds, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Harrison felt his carefully constructed world tilting off its axis. "Conference room. Now." Amara's voice cut through the noise with quiet authority. She was already moving, her heels clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who had walked into dozens of corporate disasters and emerged victorious. The emergency meeting lasted 14 hours. "The fundamental problem," Amara said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping around her eyes, "isn't operational. It's cultural. This staff doesn't trust leadership because leadership has never bothered to see them as human beings." Harrison bristled. "I provide competitive wages, comprehensive benefits. You provide the minimum required by law to people you've never bothered to know." Her words landed like physical blows. "Maria in housekeeping has been here 8 years and you don't know her name. James in maintenance has a PhD in engineering, but you've never promoted him past entry level. Rosa at the front desk speaks 4 languages and has a master's in hospitality management, but she's never been considered for management because she doesn't fit the image. How do you know all this? Because I spent 2 hours walking the halls and actually talking to people. It's amazing what you learn when you treat employees like humans instead of line items. The accusation hit harder than it should have. Harrison prided himself on efficiency, on results, on the clean separation between business and emotion that had built his empire. But watching Amara move through the resort, seeing how staff responded to her, with respect, with hope, with a kind of loyalty money couldn't buy, something uncomfortable shifted in his chest. At 2 a.m., they were alone in the conference room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the detritus of crisis management. The Miami skyline glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, beautiful and indifferent to their exhaustion. "You're good at this," Harrison said quietly. Amara looked up from her notes, surprise flickering across her features. At what? Seeing people. Really seeing them. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 18-hour days and uncomfortable truths. "I built this company by focusing on results. Numbers don't lie, don't have agendas, don't disappoint you. But they don't inspire loyalty either." Her voice was gentler now, professional armor slightly lowered. "Your Seattle numbers were perfect on paper. Your Miami projections were flawless. But both acquisitions failed because you never accounted for the human factor. People are unpredictable. People are the only thing that matters." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those intelligent dark eyes. "You can have the most sophisticated systems in the world, but if your people don't believe in the mission, if they don't feel valued, if they don't see themselves in your vision of success, you'll fail every time." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Outside, Miami's nightlife pulsed with rhythm and life, a stark contrast to the sterile conference room where 2 people sat surrounded by the wreckage of his assumptions. "Why do you do this?" Harrison asked suddenly. "Crisis management. Walking into disasters and fixing other people's mistakes." Amara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible. To be dismissed before you even speak. To have your worth questioned because of how you look instead of what you can do." She met his eyes directly. "Every company I save, every team I help rebuild, it's proof that things can change. That people can change." The words hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation. At 6 a.m., they walked through the resort together as the Miami sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. The protesters were gone, the media had moved on to fresher scandals, and the staff was beginning their morning routines with something that looked almost like hope. Ms. Williams, Maria from housekeeping, approached them near the elevator. "Thank you for listening yesterday. For the first time in 8 years, I feel like someone actually heard us." After Maria walked away, Harrison found himself watching Amara's face, the quiet satisfaction, the genuine warmth, the way she seemed to collect these moments of human connection like treasures. "I want to offer you a permanent position," he said suddenly. "VP of Organizational Development. Full autonomy, unlimited budget, equity stake." Amara stopped walking. "Why?" The question was simple. The answer was anything but. "Because you see things I don't. Because you care about things I've forgotten how to care about." He paused, something vulnerable creeping into his voice. "Because maybe it's time I learned to see people the way you do." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give her. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But if I take this job, I do it my way. No compromises on values, no exceptions for profit margins, no turning people into numbers to make spreadsheets prettier. Deal." They shook hands there in the Miami morning light, and Harrison felt something shift between them, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, small but significant. Dangerous. As they walked back toward the lobby, He found himself noticing things he'd missed before. The way morning light caught the gold flecks in Amara's brown eyes, how her laugh sounded when she spoke with the front desk staff, the graceful confidence with which she moved through the world. For the first time in his adult life, Harrison Blackwell was beginning to understand that the most important things couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. The realization terrified him. What moments in your life have forced you to see people differently than you did before? Share your thoughts below. I'm curious about the experiences that changed your perspective. The emergency board retreat at the Auberge du Soleil felt like a gilded cage suspended above Napa Valley's rolling vineyards. Harrison stood on the terrace of his suite, watching the morning mist cling to the hills like secrets reluctant to be revealed. 3 days of intensive strategy sessions had blurred together, but one constant remained. Amara Williams had become the gravitational center of every room she entered. Their Miami success had bought them breathing room, but the board wanted more, a complete overhaul of Blackwell Industries' culture and practices. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were asking the woman he'd initially dismissed to redesign the very foundation of his empire. Harrison. Her voice carried across the terrace, softer than her boardroom tone. The morning session starts in 20 minutes. He turned to find her silhouetted in the doorway, the California sun catching the bronze highlights in her hair. She wore a flowing maxi dress that skimmed her curves with elegant confidence, so different from her usual armor of power suits. Here, away from conference rooms and corporate towers, she looked almost approachable. "I needed air," he said, gesturing toward the valley. "All this talk about organizational transformation. Sometimes I wonder if we're trying to fix something that's fundamentally broken." Amara stepped onto the terrace, maintaining careful distance. "That's an interesting confession from a man who built an empire." "Built on what foundation?" The words escaped before he could stop them, raw with exhaustion from 3 sleepless nights of wrestling with questions he'd avoided for decades. "My father always said success required sacrifice. That some people belonged in the inner circle and others." He trailed off, realizing how close he was to revealing too much. "Others what?" Her voice carried no judgment, just curiosity tinged with something that might have been compassion. The morning air felt heavy with unspoken truths. Harrison found himself studying her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in the set of her shoulders, the vulnerability she tried to hide beneath professional competence. When had he stopped seeing her as a category and started seeing her as Amara? Others were obstacles to be managed, he finished quietly. Kept at arm's length for the sake of, what? Order? Control? I'm starting to think my father's wisdom was just dressed up fear. What do you think drives someone to build walls around their heart? Have you ever had to question beliefs you inherited from family? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your story. Amara moved closer, her presence both comforting and unsettling. Fear disguised as wisdom is the most dangerous kind. It feels like protection, but it's really a prison. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Williams? He meant it lightly, but her expression grew serious. That's my personal experience, Harrison. The use of his first name sent an unexpected jolt through him. In her voice, it sounded less like a title and more like an invitation. He found himself wanting to hear her say it again. "Tell me," he said, surprising himself with the request. She leaned against the terrace railing, her gaze distant. "My father was a brilliant engineer who never got the recognition he deserved. Passed over for promotions, excluded from opportunities, told he wasn't leadership material. He became bitter, built walls around our family to protect us from disappointment." Harrison waited, sensing there was more. "He taught me that the world would try to diminish me, so I had to be twice as good, work twice as hard, and never let them see me sweat. For years, I thought his armor was strength. It took me too long to realize it was just another kind of prison." "What changed?" "I met someone who saw through the armor." Her smile held both warmth and sadness. "My mentor, Dr. Eleanor Hobbs. She was everything my father warned me white corporate America would never accept: brilliant, uncompromising, and absolutely refused to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Harrison felt a strange pang at the mention of another person seeing Amara's true self. What happened to her? Cancer. 5 years ago. Amara's voice grew quiet. Before she died, she made me promise something. She said, "Amara, don't let survival become your only way of living. The world needs your whole heart, not just your sharp mind." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of wind through grapevines and the weight of shared vulnerability. Harrison found himself wondering when he'd last told anyone about his own walls, his own inherited fears. "My father built Blackwell Industries on the principle of cultural fit," he heard himself saying. He believed successful organizations required homogeneity. People who thought alike, looked alike, shared the same values and background. Meaning white, male, preferably Ivy League educated, from families with established wealth. The words tasted bitter now. Anyone else was a risk factor, a variable that could disrupt the ecosystem. Amara turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "And you believed that?" "I inherited it. There's a difference." But even as he said it, Harrison knew how weak that sounded. For 23 years, I told myself I was protecting something valuable, maintaining standards, ensuring compatibility. "What you were doing," Amara said quietly, "was replicating trauma. Your father's fear became your policy." The words hit like a physical blow, partly because they were true and partly because she'd said them without cruelty. Just fact, delivered with the precision of a surgeon making a necessary incision. He was terrified, Harrison continued, the confession pouring out like water through a broken dam. His own father lost everything in the Great Depression, family business destroyed, reputation ruined. My grandfather spent the rest of his life rebuilding, convinced that one wrong choice, one moment of letting his guard down, would destroy everything again. So he taught your father that different meant dangerous. And my father taught me that control meant survival. Harrison looked out over the valley, seeing it differently now, not just beauty, but cycles of growth and death, seasons of abundance and scarcity. I've spent my entire adult life building walls to keep out anything that might threaten what we'd accumulated. Including people like me. It wasn't a question. Harrison met her gaze, feeling the full weight of his choices reflected in her eyes. Including people like you. They stood in silence, the morning sun climbing higher, burning away the mist to reveal the landscape in sharp detail. Harrison felt exposed, stripped of the carefully constructed explanations he'd carried for decades. The irony, he said finally, is that trying to preserve everything might be what destroys it. Our company culture is stagnating. We're losing market share to competitors who embrace innovation over tradition. The very homogeneity my father prized is making us irrelevant. And personally? Amara asked softly. What is your fear costing you personally? The question pierced deeper than he expected. Harrison thought of his empty penthouse, his carefully curated social circle of people who shared his background but not necessarily his interests or values. He thought of relationships that felt more like strategic alliances than genuine connections. Everything, he whispered. It's costing me everything that matters. A tear traced down Amara's cheek, and Harrison felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to comfort her. But something in her posture suggested this wasn't about his pain, it was about her own. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely audible. Something I haven't told anyone since it happened. Harrison waited, every instinct screaming that this moment would change everything between them. 3 years ago, I was hired by a Fortune 500 company to lead their diversity initiative. The CEO, a man not unlike you, brought me in after a discrimination lawsuit. He needed someone with my credentials to clean up their image. Her hands gripped the railing tighter. For 6 months, I worked 18-hour days designing programs, restructuring policies, training leadership. I believed I was making a difference. Then I discovered the truth. I was window dressing. They had no intention of implementing my recommendations. They just needed to show they'd hired a black woman consultant to appease the courts. Harrison felt sick. Amara. When I confronted him, do you know what he said? Her voice grew stronger, fueled by the memory of injustice. He said, "Sweetheart, you should be grateful. We paid you very well to play dress-up for 6 months. Don't mistake that for being qualified to actually run anything important." The rage that flooded Harrison's system surprised him with its intensity. The thought of someone diminishing Amara's brilliance, reducing her to a prop in their corporate theater, made him want to tear something apart with his bare hands. "I walked out that day," she continued, "and I promised myself I would never again work for someone who saw me as a token rather than a person. When your company called, my first instinct was to decline. But Maya convinced me that maybe, just maybe, you might be different." "Am I?" Harrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Different." Amara studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing everything she'd observed over the past weeks. "I don't know yet. But I'm starting to hope you might be." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Harrison felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world shifting, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the inexorable patience of tide wearing away stone. "I want to be," he said quietly. "Different, I mean. Better than what I inherited." Wanting isn't enough, Harrison. Change requires action. It requires being willing to lose things you thought you needed in order to gain things you never knew you wanted. Before he could respond, the sharp chime of his phone shattered the moment. The board meeting. Reality crashed back in waves. Responsibilities, expectations, the weight of an empire that depended on his decisions. But as they walked back toward the conference room, something had fundamentally altered. The walls he'd spent decades building felt suddenly fragile, and the woman walking beside him no longer felt like a threat to his carefully ordered world. She felt like its salvation. The private jet descended through wispy clouds toward the Napa Valley, its wings catching the golden afternoon light that painted California's wine country in shades of amber and green. What had started as a business retreat to finalize the Miami solutions had transformed into something neither Harrison nor Amara had anticipated. 48 hours away from boardrooms, away from the suffocating weight of corporate expectations, away from the carefully constructed walls they'd spent lifetimes building. Harrison watched Amara through the small jet's window as she gazed down at the rolling vineyards below, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. 3 weeks of working together had stripped away his assumptions layer by layer, like peeling back the pages of a book he'd been too afraid to read. She wasn't just brilliant, she was kind in ways that made his chest ache. She wasn't just strong, she was vulnerable in moments that made him want to protect something precious he'd never known existed. "It's beautiful," she murmured, not looking away from the landscape. "I've never been to wine country." Never. The surprise in his voice was genuine. In his world, Napa weekends were as common as Monday meetings. She turned to him then, and he caught something unguarded in her dark eyes. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, wine country felt about as accessible as Mars. Even now. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm visiting someone else's world." The jet touched down on the private airstrip, and Harrison felt something shift in his chest, a protectiveness that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way she'd said someone else's world, as if she'd spent her entire life looking through windows at spaces she wasn't meant to enter. An hour later, they stood on the terrace of Auberge du Soleil, the valley spreading below them like a patchwork quilt of green and gold. The resort was Harrison's usual choice for client entertainment. Elegant, exclusive, the kind of place where deals were made over wine that cost more than most people's rent. But with Amara beside him, everything felt different. The sunset seemed more vivid, the air more fragrant with lavender and jasmine. "You're staring," she said softly, not looking at him but smiling in a way that made his pulse quicken. "I'm thinking," he replied, which was both true and completely inadequate. Dangerous territory for a CEO. Her teasing had an edge of warmth that made him want to confess things he'd never told another soul. They'd spent the afternoon touring the property, ostensibly planning the final presentation for the board, but really just existing in the same space without the pressure of proving anything to anyone. Amara had laughed, really laughed, when he'd admitted he couldn't tell a Cabernet from a Merlot despite owning stock in 3 wineries. He'd watched her taste wine for the first time with the focused attention she brought to everything, her eyes closing as she savored flavors he'd never bothered to notice. Have you ever had a moment when someone completely changed how you saw the world? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear about those life-changing encounters. Now, as evening painted the sky in shades of rose and purple, they sat at a small table overlooking the valley, sharing a dinner that felt more intimate than any business meal had a right to be. The restaurant buzzed quietly around them, but Harrison found himself leaning forward, drawn into the magnetic field of Amara's presence. "Tell me something real," she said suddenly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "Not CEO Harrison, not the man who built an empire. Just you." The request should have triggered every defense mechanism he'd spent decades perfecting. Instead, he found himself wanting to answer, wanting to lay down the armor that felt heavier with each passing day. "I'm tired," he said, the words surprising him with their honesty. "I'm 38 years old, I have everything I thought I wanted, and I'm so goddamn tired of being who everyone expects me to be." Amara's eyes softened, and she reached across the small table, her fingers brushing his hand. The contact was electric, sending warmth up his arm and straight to the center of his chest. "Who do you want to be?" she asked, and her voice was so gentle it made something crack inside him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been Harrison Blackwell, CEO. For so long I'm not sure there's anything else left." "There is," she said with quiet certainty. "I've seen glimpses of him. The man who noticed I'd never been to wine country. The one who made sure I had my favorite tea in every meeting room. The one who actually listens when I talk, not just to my ideas but to me." He turned his hand palm up, letting their fingers intertwine. Her skin was warm, soft, real in a way that made his carefully ordered world feel like a house of cards. "What about you?" he asked. "What does Dr. Amara Williams want when she's not saving failing companies?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her internal debate, the lifetime of caution warring with something newer, more dangerous. "I want to stop feeling like I have to be perfect," she said finally. "I want to stop proving I belong in every room I enter. I want—" She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "I want to trust that someone could see all of me, my ambition, my insecurities, my dreams, my fears, and not run away." The honesty in her voice hit him like a physical blow. How many walls had she built? How many times had she been made to feel like she needed to earn her place in spaces where others simply belonged by birthright? "Amara," he said, her name feeling different on his tongue. Not professional, not careful, but intimate. Real. "I know this is complicated," she said quickly, as if afraid he was about to pull away. "I know we come from different worlds, and I know—" "Stop." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and he saw her breath catch. "Just stop thinking for a minute. Stop analyzing and protecting and worrying about what this means or where it leads." The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving them in the soft glow of candlelight and string lights that twinkled like stars. Around them, the restaurant had grown quieter, more intimate, as if the whole world had dimmed to accommodate this moment. "I've never felt this before," he said, the words coming from someplace deep and unguarded. "This pull. Like your gravity, and I've been floating in space my whole life." Amara's eyes glistened, and he realized she was fighting tears. Not sad ones, but the kind that came when someone finally said the thing you've been hoping to hear. "Harrison," she whispered, and the way she said his name, soft, wondering, without any of the professional distance she usually maintained, made him want to rewrite every rule he'd ever lived by. They walked back to their adjoining suites in comfortable silence, the wine and conversation creating a bubble of intimacy that felt both fragile and inevitable. At her door, they stopped, the weight of possibility hanging between them like summer air before a storm. "This changes everything," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I know." He stepped closer, close enough to smell her perfume, to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. "You. More than I've ever been in my life." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "But for the first time in years, I'm more afraid of not taking the risk than I am of taking it." When she rose on her toes to meet his kiss, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. Her lips were soft, warm, and tasted like wine and possibility. His other arm circled her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted against him in a way that made every defense mechanism he'd ever built seem foolish and unnecessary. The kiss deepened, became something desperate and seeking, as if they were both trying to communicate everything they couldn't say in words. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush this," he said, though every cell in his body was screaming the opposite. "I don't want to mess this up by moving too fast or—" "Harrison." Her hands came up to frame his face, and her smile was radiant in the dim hallway light. "For once in your life, stop overthinking. I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a demand. When she slipped into her room, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, marveling at how completely his world had shifted on its axis. Inside his own suite, Harrison walked to the window overlooking the valley, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. For 38 years, he'd lived by rules, by expectations, by the careful construction of walls designed to keep the world at a manageable distance. Tonight, those walls lay in ruins around his feet, and instead of feeling exposed, he felt free. His phone buzzed with a text from Amara, "Sweet dreams. Thank you for seeing me." He typed back, "Thank you for letting me." As he prepared for bed, Harrison caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened. His shoulders had lost their perpetual tension. He looked happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way he couldn't remember ever being. Tomorrow they would return to New York, to boardrooms and expectations and the complicated reality of their professional relationship. But tonight, in this valley that grew things from nothing but sun and soil and patient tending, something new had taken root between them. Something that felt like hope. Something that felt like love. Harrison fell asleep to the sound of wind through the vineyard, dreaming of dark eyes and soft laughter, of a woman who had walked into his carefully ordered world and shown him what he'd been missing all along. In the suite next door, Amara lay awake staring at the ceiling, her fingers still tingling from his touch, her heart racing with the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that everything had changed. She'd spent her entire career building walls, protecting herself from environments that didn't welcome her presence. But tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she'd let someone see past the armor to the woman underneath. And instead of running, he'd stepped closer. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss, and wondered if this was what it felt like to finally truly belong somewhere, not because she'd earned it or proved herself, but simply because someone had chosen to see her worth. The thought was as thrilling as it was terrifying. The Portland ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the muted conversations of tech industry elite, but Harrison felt like he was suffocating. 3 weeks had passed since Napa Valley, 3 weeks of stolen moments, late-night phone calls, and a growing certainty that Amara had become more essential to his breathing than oxygen itself. She stood across the room in a stunning emerald dress that hugged every magnificent curve, commanding attention from a circle of executives who hung on her every word about sustainable business practices. Her laughter floated above the crowd, rich and genuine, and Harrison's chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to pride. "My woman," his heart whispered, and the thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Harrison. His father's voice cut through his reverie like ice water. Charles Blackwell materialized beside his son, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying the same predatory elegance that had built their empire. "We need to talk." Harrison's shoulders tensed. His father's unexpected appearance at the tech summit meant only one thing: someone had been talking. About what? About your distraction. Charles's gaze flicked toward Amara with surgical precision. "Word travels fast in our circles, son. Your board members are concerned about your judgment." The words hit like physical blows. Harrison had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in theory, but reality felt like drowning. "My judgment has never been better. Our Seattle integration is ahead of schedule, profits are." "This isn't about profits." Charles stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone that had intimidated Harrison since childhood. "This is about legacy. About maintaining standards. About remembering who we are and where we come from." Across the room, Amara glanced over, her smile bright and trusting. She raised her champagne glass slightly in his direction, a private toast to the future they'd whispered about under Napa Valley stars. The gesture was so full of love and hope that Harrison's throat constricted. "She's brilliant," Harrison said quietly, the words feeling like rebellion. "She's transformed our entire." "She's a phase." Charles's interruption was surgical. "A very expensive, very public phase that's making our investors nervous. Henderson's already asking questions. So is Morrison. They're wondering if you've lost sight of what built this company." The familiar weight settled on Harrison's chest, the crushing pressure of expectations, of maintaining an image crafted over decades. He'd built his entire identity around being the son who never disappointed, the heir who understood the rules. But looking at Amara, radiant and confident and everything beautiful about tomorrow, those rules felt like chains. "I love her," he said, the words barely audible. Charles's expression didn't change. "Love is a luxury we can't afford. Not at our level. Not with our responsibilities." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The Henderson merger depends on traditional values, Harrison. Family values. The kind of stability that comes from appropriate choices. The Henderson merger. $2 billion. Hundreds of jobs. The crown jewel of everything they'd worked toward. End it," Charles continued, his voice gentle but implacable. "Quietly. Professionally. Before it costs us everything." Harrison felt something breaking inside his chest, a fracture that started small and spread like spider web cracks through glass. Across the room, Amara was still watching him, and the trust in her eyes was unbearable. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Henderson's people want to meet tomorrow. They're ready to sign. $2 billion. His father's approval. The life he'd spent decades building. Or Amara. The choice felt impossible, but as Harrison looked at his father's expectant face, he felt himself falling back into patterns worn smooth by years of compliance. The dutiful son. The careful heir. The man who never risked the empire for anything as fragile as love. "I understand," he heard himself saying. Charles smiled, the first genuine warmth Harrison had seen from him in months. "I knew you would. You're a Blackwell, after all." But as his father moved away, Harrison felt like he was watching his soul walk across the room toward the woman who had shown him what it meant to be fully alive, carrying with it the weight of betrayal he was already planning. 20 minutes later, Harrison found himself standing beside Amara on the hotel's outdoor terrace, the Portland city lights stretching below them like scattered diamonds. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and the distant promise of winter. "You've been quiet tonight," Amara said softly, her hand finding his on the stone railing. "Everything okay?" Her touch burned. Harrison stared out at the Columbia River, gathering the words that would destroy the best thing that had ever happened to him. The script was already written, Professional distance, mutual respect, the gradual cooling that would preserve both their dignities. But when he turned to look at her, the words crumbled. She was so beautiful it hurt, not just the stunning curves or the way moonlight loved her skin, but the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the generous heart that had somehow found room for a man who didn't deserve her. "Amara," he began, then stopped. She stepped closer, reading the tension in his silence. "Talk to me, Harrison. What's wrong?" "My father was right," he said finally, the words tasting like ash. "About maintaining standards. About appropriate choices." The change in her expression was subtle but devastating. The slight stiffening of her shoulders, the careful neutrality that replaced her open warmth. She'd heard this song before, had probably been expecting it. "I see," she said quietly. "The Henderson merger is worth $2 billion, Harrison continued, hating himself with every word. "Our investors expect certain stability. Traditional values. Traditional values." Amara's voice was steady, but Harrison caught the tremor underneath. "You mean white values?" The accusation hung between them like a blade. Harrison wanted to deny it, to explain that it wasn't about race but about business, about legacy, about forces bigger than both of them. But the words would have been lies, and they both knew it. "I have responsibilities," he said instead, the phrase sounding as hollow as he felt. Amara nodded slowly, her professional mask sliding into place with practiced ease. "Of course you do." She stepped back, creating distance that felt like an ocean. "I understand completely." But her eyes, God, her eyes were full of pain and disappointment and a kind of weary recognition that cut deeper than anger would have. "This was always temporary," Harrison said, trying to convince himself as much as her. "We both knew that. Did we?" Amara's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Because I thought," she stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Harrison wanted to take it all back, to tell her about his father's ultimatum, about the crushing weight of expectations, about how loving her had shown him who he could be instead of who he was supposed to be. Instead, he said, "You'll finish the Seattle project, of course. Your work has been exemplary." Exemplary. Amara's laugh was bitter. "How generous of you." She turned to go, and panic seized Harrison's chest. "Amara, wait." "No." Her voice cut through the night air like crystal. "Don't make this harder than it already is." She paused at the terrace door, her back still turned. "For what it's worth, Harrison, I thought you were braver than this." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Harrison stood alone on the terrace, the Portland lights blurring as something hot and foreign stung his eyes. In the distance, he could hear the murmur of the party continuing, the sound of a world that had no idea he'd just destroyed the best part of himself. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant. "Henderson confirmed for 9 a.m. "Congratulations, sir." "Congratulations." The word felt like mockery. He'd won everything his father wanted, everything his legacy demanded. So why did victory taste like death? Inside the hotel elevator, Amara pressed herself against the back wall and finally let the tears fall. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but the reality still cut deeper than she'd expected. 20 floors to her room. 20 floors to hold herself together before she could finally break apart in private. The elevator's soft jazz felt like a funeral dirge for dreams she'd been foolish enough to believe. What do you think hurts more, being abandoned by someone you love, or realizing they were never brave enough to fight for you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Manhattan, Harrison's penthouse, 3:47 a.m. Harrison stood at his penthouse window, the city lights blurring through exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to despair. 3 days had passed since the board meeting. 3 days since he'd watched Amara Williams walk out of his life with her dignity intact and his heart in pieces. The silence felt suffocating. His reflection stared back from the glass, hollow-eyed, unshaven, wearing the same clothes he'd put on yesterday morning. Or was it the day before? Time had become meaningless since he'd chosen cowardice over courage, fear over love. His phone buzzed for the 100th time. Text messages from board members, missed calls from his father, emails marked urgent that felt trivial compared to the weight crushing his chest. But no word from Amara. Nothing from the woman whose absence had turned his perfectly ordered world into chaos. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 23 years building walls to keep people out, and now the one person he desperately wanted inside was gone forever. Chicago, Amara's apartment, same time. Amara sat curled in her reading chair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she stared at the lake through her windows. The water was choppy tonight, reflecting her inner turmoil in waves that caught and scattered the moonlight. Maya had been calling every few hours, worried about her friend's unusual silence. But what could she say? That she'd fallen for a man who'd humiliated her in front of his entire board? That she'd been foolish enough to believe someone could change that quickly, that completely? Her laptop was open on the coffee table, the cursor blinking in an empty email draft. She'd started a dozen messages to Harrison and deleted them all. What was left to say? He'd made his choice public and brutal. The man who'd held her so tenderly in Napa Valley had evaporated the moment his comfort zone was threatened. But God help her, she missed him. Missed the vulnerability he'd shown her in those quiet moments. Missed the way he'd looked at her like she was a miracle instead of a problem to be solved. Manhattan, Harrison's study, 4:15 a.m. Harrison found himself standing before his father's portrait, the oil painting that had dominated his study for 15 years. Marcus Blackwell Sr. stared down with the same cold gray eyes that Harrison saw in the mirror every morning, eyes that had never learned to see people as anything more than assets or liabilities. "You built this company on hate," Harrison whispered to the painted face. "And I've been too much of a coward to tear it down." He thought about Amara's words in Napa Valley. The hardest thing about healing is admitting you were wounded in the first place. She'd been talking about her own journey, but now he understood she'd been offering him a roadmap he'd been too afraid to follow. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Weakness is letting emotion cloud judgment, Harrison. The moment you start seeing employees as family, you've lost control." But what if control was the problem? What if the very foundation he'd built his life on was rotting from within? Harrison pulled out his phone and scrolled to Dr. Patricia Chun, the therapist Amara had mentioned, someone who specialized in helping people unlearn inherited trauma. His finger hovered over the call button. It was nearly dawn, but something told him this couldn't wait another day. Chicago, 5:30 a.m. Amara was making coffee when her phone rang. The unknown Manhattan number made her heart leap and crash simultaneously. She let it go to voicemail, her hands shaking as she poured hot water over the coffee grounds. But curiosity won. She played the message on speaker. "Dr. Williams, this is Dr. Patricia Chun. I know it's early, but I have an unusual situation. A client of mine, someone you apparently recommended my services to, has asked if you might be willing to participate in what he's calling a truth and reconciliation session. I don't typically arrange such meetings, but his case is extraordinary. He's requested that I facilitate a conversation between you both, if you're willing. No pressure, no obligations. Just two people trying to find a way forward. Please call me when you get this." Amara stared at the phone, her heart hammering. Harrison had called a therapist. Harrison had asked for help. Harrison was trying to build a bridge she thought he'd burned beyond repair. Manhattan, Dr. Chen's office, 2 p.m. The neutral beige walls of Dr. Chen's office felt like a sanctuary and a courtroom combined. Harrison arrived first, his usual armor of expensive suits replaced by simple jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more vulnerable. When Amara walked in 30 minutes later, the air seemed to crackle with electricity. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her skin, her natural hair pulled back in a way that highlighted the strength in her jawline. She was beautiful and formidable, and everything he didn't deserve. "Thank you both for coming," Dr. Chen said, her voice calm and professional. "Harrison has asked for this opportunity to share some difficult truths. Amara, you're under no obligation to respond or engage beyond what feels safe for you. This is about creating space for honesty, not demanding forgiveness." Harrison's hands trembled as he looked at Amara. She met his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "I need to start by saying I'm sorry," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "Not just for the board meeting, but for every moment before that when I chose my comfort over your dignity. For every time I let my father's poison run through my veins instead of fighting it." Amara said nothing, but her fingers loosened slightly around her purse strap. "Dr. Chun has been helping me understand that my rules, those goddamn rules, weren't about business standards. They were about fear. Fear that if I let people in, if I saw them as human instead of categories, I might have to confront how broken I really am." His voice cracked. "My father built Blackwell Industries on exclusion and exploitation. He taught me that caring was weakness, that vulnerability was failure. And I was so terrified of disappointing him, even after his death, that I became him. I became the thing I should have been fighting." Amara shifted in her chair, and Harrison caught a glimpse of the woman who'd laughed with him over wine in Napa Valley. "The truth is, I fell in love with you the moment you walked into that boardroom and refused to be diminished by my prejudice. But I was too much of a coward to admit it, too afraid to choose you over the legacy that was killing me from the inside." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Dr. Chen's clock. Finally, Amara spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Do you know what the cruelest part was, Harrison? It wasn't the public humiliation. It was knowing that you were capable of being better and choosing not to be when it mattered most." Harrison closed his eyes, the words hitting like physical blows. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she continued. "I don't know if you can actually change, or if this is just another performance designed to get what you want." "I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve your trust. But I'm asking for the chance to earn it back. Not as your client, not as your employer, but as a man who's finally ready to tear down everything toxic he's built and start over." Amara looked at Dr. Chun, then back at Harrison. "What does that look like, practically? Because pretty words in a therapist's office are one thing. Action in the real world is another." Harrison pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I've spent the last 3 days with lawyers and my board. Blackwell Industries is implementing a complete overhaul of our hiring practices, our company culture, our leadership training. We're partnering with organizations that promote diversity and inclusion. And I'm stepping down as CEO." Amara's eyes widened. "What?" "I'm staying on as chairman, but I'm bringing in new leadership, people who can build the company I should have created from the beginning. I can't undo 23 years of damage overnight, but I can make sure it stops with me." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and terror. "There's something else," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I bought a house. In Chicago. Near the lake." He looked directly into her eyes. "I'm not asking you to be with me. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to prove that love is stronger than fear, that people can change if they want it badly enough." Amara felt tears threatening, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "Harrison." "I know I'm asking too much," he said quickly. "I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal. But if there's even a chance, if there's the smallest possibility that what we found in Napa Valley was real, then I want to fight for it. I want to fight for us." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. "Amara, what are you feeling right now?" The question opened something in her chest that she'd been trying to keep locked away. "Terrified," she admitted. "Hopeful. Angry. Confused." She looked at Harrison through her tears. "I love you, you impossible man. I love you and I hate that I love you, and I'm scared that loving you means compromising everything I've fought to build. It doesn't, Harrison said urgently. God, Amara, loving you has made me want to be worthy of you. You make me better, not weaker. You challenge me to live up to the man you saw in me before I could see him myself. The room felt charged with possibility, with the dangerous hope of second chances. I need time, Amara said finally. I need to see what you do when you think no one's watching. I need to know that this change comes from conviction, not just consequence. Harrison nodded, understanding flooding his face. Whatever you need. However long it takes. And I need you to understand something, she continued, her voice growing stronger. If we do this, if we try to build something together, it has to be as equals. Not you rescuing me, not me fixing you, but two whole people choosing each other every single day. Yes, he breathed. Yes, absolutely. As they left Dr. Chen's office, walking toward separate elevators that would take them to separate lives, Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine hope. Not the hollow confidence of control, but the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of authentic connection. Amara paused at her elevator, looking back at him one last time. Harrison. Yeah. The house by the lake. Does it have a good view? A smile broke across his face, the first real smile in days. The best view in Chicago. Right next to this incredible woman's building. Pure coincidence, of course. Despite herself, Amara laughed. Of course. As the elevator doors closed between them, both felt a shift, from ending to beginning, from closed to cautiously open, from fear to the dangerous territory of hope. The choice had been made. Now came the harder part, living it. What do you think it takes for someone to truly change? Have you ever given someone a second chance that surprised you? Share your thoughts below. I believe in the power of transformation and would love to hear your stories. 6 months later, Chicago lakefront, December morning. The first snow of winter dusted Lake Michigan's shore as Amara walked along the familiar path she'd taken every morning for the past 4 months. The routine had become sacred. Coffee at sunrise, 30 minutes of solitude before the day demanded her attention, and lately, the quiet awareness that someone else had adopted the same rhythm. Harrison's house sat 3 blocks north of hers, a modest Victorian that looked nothing like the Manhattan penthouse where their story had begun. She'd watched him transform over these months through small glimpses, carrying groceries, walking to the neighborhood coffee shop, sitting on his front porch reading actual books instead of quarterly reports. He'd kept his promise about space, never approaching, never pressuring, just existing in her periphery like a question waiting patiently for an answer. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Girl, how long are you going to keep torturing that man? Even I feel sorry for him now, and you know how I feel about corporate types. Amara smiled, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Maya had been watching this slow dance with the fascination of someone observing a particularly complex chess match. But this wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about trust, rebuilt one careful day at a time. The changes at Blackwell Industries had made national business news. Harrison hadn't just implemented diversity initiatives. He'd completely restructured the company's culture from the ground up. The new CEO, Dr. Keisha Johnson, was a brilliant black woman from Stanford who'd been given complete autonomy to reshape the organization. More importantly, the changes seemed genuine. Amara had quietly reached out to several employees through her professional network. The transformation was real, uncomfortable, and ongoing, exactly what authentic change looked like. But it was the smaller things that had slowly worn down her defenses. The way Harrison had donated anonymously to her favorite scholarship fund until someone at the organization accidentally let it slip. His regular attendance at a community center in Bronzeville, tutoring kids in business basics. The therapy sessions he'd continued even after their meeting with Dr. Chun, because he'd finally understood that healing wasn't a destination but a practice. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Unknown number, but something made her answer. Dr. Williams? This is Jennifer Martinez from the Chicago Tribune. I'm working on a follow-up piece about corporate transformation in America, and I'd love to get your perspective on the Blackwell Industries changes. You were involved in their initial consultation, correct? Amara paused her walk, considering. I can't speak to confidential client matters, but I'd be happy to discuss corporate change management in general terms. Perfect. Also, there's a rumor that Harrison Blackwell has relocated to Chicago. Can you confirm if that's connected to ongoing consulting work? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Amara found herself at the crossroads she'd been avoiding for months, the moment when silence became complicity in their separate suffering. No comment on Mr. Blackwell's personal choices, she said carefully. But I will say this, real transformation requires proximity to the things that make you uncomfortable. Sometimes the greatest courage is choosing to grow in the place where growth is hardest. After ending the call, Amara stood looking out at the lake, finally understanding what her heart had been trying to tell her for months. Manhattan Blackwell Tower, same day, 2 p.m. Harrison sat in what used to be his corner office, now belonging to Dr. Johnson, waiting for their monthly transition meeting. The space looked completely different, warmer, more collaborative, with artwork from local artists covering the walls where his father's portrait used to hang. You look like hell, Keisha said, settling into her chair with characteristic directness. At 42, she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation, everything Harrison was learning to become. Thanks for the pep talk, he replied, managing a weak smile. When's the last time you actually talked to her instead of conducting this elaborate courtship by proximity? Harrison had made the mistake of confiding in Keisha during one of their early meetings, and she'd been ruthlessly supportive ever since, the kind of friend who told you uncomfortable truths because she cared about your growth. She said she needed time to see who I am when no one's watching. I'm giving her time. Brother, 6 months of living 3 blocks away and pretending you don't see each other at the coffee shop isn't giving her time. It's giving her an excuse to stay scared. You want to know who you are when no one's watching? You're a man in love who's too afraid to fight for what matters most. Harrison stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the city that had shaped him and nearly destroyed him. What if she says no? What if I've waited too long, changed too much, not enough? Then you'll know, Keisha said simply. But right now, you're both living in limbo, and that's not fair to either of you. You've done the work, Harrison. You've changed the company, changed yourself, changed everything you could control. But love isn't about control, it's about courage. That evening, Harrison found himself on a plane to Chicago, his hands shaking as he typed and deleted a dozen text messages to Amara. Finally, he settled on something simple: I'm coming home. Not to pressure you, not to demand anything. Just to finally tell you what I should have said 6 months ago. Chicago, Amara's apartment, 8:30 p.m. Amara stared at Harrison's message, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it, the inevitable collision of their careful distance with a growing certainty that she was ready to stop running from the possibility of them. She called Maya, who answered on the first ring. He's coming, isn't he? Maya said without preamble. How did you? Honey, I've been watching you two dance around each other for 6 months. The man bought a house 3 blocks away and has been living like a monk, waiting for you to decide if you can trust him. Meanwhile, you've been researching everything about his company changes like you're writing a dissertation on corporate redemption. Y'all are ridiculous. Amara laughed despite her nerves. I'm terrified, Maya. Good. Terror means it matters. Now stop overthinking and go get your man. At 10:47 p.m., Amara's doorbell rang. She'd changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on jeans and the soft sweater Harrison had complimented during their last night in Napa Valley, the one that made her feel beautiful and powerful simultaneously. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Harrison stood in the hallway holding a single white rose, wearing the same vulnerable expression he'd worn in Dr. Chen's office. But something was different, steadier, more grounded. The desperate edge had been replaced by quiet certainty. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi yourself." She stepped aside, and he entered her space for the first time, taking in the warm colors, the books everywhere, the photographs of family and friends that made the apartment unmistakably hers. "It's beautiful," he said. "It feels like you." They stood in her living room. 6 months of careful distance suddenly collapsed into arm's reach. The air hummed with everything unsaid, every careful boundary finally ready to be crossed. "I got your message," Amara said. "I couldn't wait anymore. Not because I'm impatient, but because I finally understand the difference between waiting and hiding." Harrison set the rose on her coffee table, his hands steady. "I've spent 6 months proving to you that I could change, but I think I've been proving it to myself too." "And what did you discover?" "That loving you didn't make me weak. Living without you did. That transformation isn't a destination, it's a daily practice. And that I'd rather fail at building something real with you than succeed at anything else alone." Amara felt tears threatening, the wall she'd so carefully maintained finally crumbling. "Harrison, I know you're scared. I know I gave you every reason to doubt me. But I'm not the same man who hurt you in that boardroom. I'm not asking you to forget what happened or pretend it didn't matter. I'm asking you to see who I've become and decide if it's someone you want to build a future with." She moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, close enough to touch the face she dreamed about for 6 months. "Show me," she whispered. "What?" "Show me who you've become. Not with words, not with grand gestures. Show me." Harrison cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "I love you, Amara Williams. I love your strength and your compassion and your refusal to accept less than you deserve. I love that you challenged me to be better and then gave me the space to actually do it. I love that you're brave enough to open your heart again even though I broke it the first time. And I love you," she said, the words releasing something that had been held prisoner in her chest. "I love the man you were brave enough to become. I love that you chose growth over comfort, change over control. I love that you moved to Chicago not to chase me, but to chase the person you wanted to be." When their lips met, it felt like coming home and setting off on an adventure simultaneously. The kiss was tender and desperate, gentle and consuming, carrying 6 months of longing and the promise of everything they could build together. "Are you sure?" Harrison whispered against her lips. "Are you sure you want to try this with me?" "I'm terrified," Amara admitted. "But I'm more terrified of letting fear make my choices for me. Yes, Harrison. Yes to trying, yes to building something beautiful together, yes to love that makes us both braver." Manhattan, 1 year later, Blackwell Tower Boardroom. The Blackwell Industries annual board meeting looked nothing like the sterile, intimidating gatherings of Harrison's father's era. The room buzzed with diverse voices, innovative ideas, and the kind of collaborative energy that actually got things done. Harrison watched from his position as chairman as Dr. Johnson presented the company's most successful year in its history. Profits were up, employee satisfaction had skyrocketed, and they'd been named one of the best places to work by 3 major publications. But the real victory sat in the third row, Amara, elegant in a navy suit, taking notes as the company's new director of organizational development. She joined Blackwell Industries 6 months ago, not as Harrison's girlfriend, but as the most qualified person for a job that desperately needed doing. Their relationship had evolved carefully, built on daily choices to trust, communicate, and support each other's growth. They'd had fights, real ones, about boundaries and independence and the careful balance between love and identity. They'd had breakthroughs too, moments when Harrison's patient consistency met Amara's cautious vulnerability and created something stronger than either could achieve alone. And finally, Dr. Johnson was saying, "I want to acknowledge our chairman, Harrison Blackwell, whose commitment to transformation has made all of this possible. Harrison, would you like to say a few words?" Harrison stood, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity his father had worked so hard to exclude. 3 years ago, this company was built on fear, exclusion, and the toxic belief that success required diminishing others. Today we're proving that the opposite is true, that our strength comes from embracing difference, that our innovation comes from including voices that challenge us to be better. His eyes found Amara's, and she smiled the kind of smile that made him understand why poets wrote about love transforming the world. Change is possible, he continued. Not easy, not comfortable, but possible. Sometimes it takes meeting someone who sees who you could become instead of just who you are. Sometimes it takes having the courage to disappoint the voices from your past, so you can honor the voice of your future. The applause was warm, genuine, nothing like the polite obligation of his father's era. After the meeting, as the boardroom emptied, Harrison and Amara found themselves alone in the space where their story had nearly ended before it began. "Remember when you walked in here for the first time?" Harrison asked, pulling her close. "You mean when you looked at me like I was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected?" Amara teased, but her tone was gentle. "I was an idiot." "Yes, you were. But you were an idiot with potential." She straightened his tie, a gesture that had become their private ritual. "Lucky for you, I have a weakness for transformation stories." "Just transformation stories?" "Well," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly, "I also have a weakness for men brave enough to tear down everything toxic they've built and start over. Turns out that's incredibly sexy." Harrison laughed, spinning her around the empty boardroom while she squealed in protest and delight. When he set her down, they were both breathless, giddy with the joy of being exactly where they belonged. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the word surprising them both. Amara stared at him, her heart stopping and starting again. "What?" "Marry me. Not because we've fixed everything, not because love has made us perfect, but because I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you every single day. I want to build something beautiful with you, raise children who never doubt they belong everywhere they go, create a legacy that heals instead of harms." "Harrison Blackwell," she said, tears streaming down her face, "are you proposing to me in the same boardroom where you almost destroyed us?" "I'm proposing to you in the place where we learned that love is stronger than fear, that people can change, that sometimes the best thing you can do is tear down what doesn't serve you and build something worthy of who you're becoming." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." As they kissed in the Manhattan boardroom where hatred had once held court, the city sparkled beyond the windows like a promise. They had both been broken when they found each other, he by inherited poison, she by systemic barriers that demanded she prove her worth again and again. But broken didn't mean unfixable. Wounded didn't mean worthless. And sometimes, when two people were brave enough to choose healing over hurting, transformation over stagnation, love over fear, sometimes they could build something so beautiful it redeemed every painful step that brought them together. The Blackwell Industries empire would continue, but it would be built on inclusion instead of exclusion, on lifting people up instead of keeping them out. Their children would inherit not just wealth but wisdom, not just power but purpose. And in a corner office that had once housed prejudice, a new kind of legacy was taking root, one written in courage, watered with tears of joy, and destined to bloom for generations to come. Love had won. Not easily, not quickly, but completely. And that, Amara thought as Harrison slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, was exactly how the best stories ended. Not with perfection, but with transformation, not with certainty, but with commitment, not with the promise that love would be easy, but with the conviction that it would be worth it. The Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly beyond the windows, full of possibilities neither of them could have imagined when their story began. But then again, the best love stories were always about becoming people you never thought possible, together. 2 years later, Chicago lakefront, wedding day. The ceremony was simple, elegant, held in the lakefront park where they'd spent months carefully rebuilding trust. Harrison's groomsmen included Dr. Chun, Keisha Johnson, and 3 employees whose lives had been changed by Blackwell Industries' transformation. Amara's bridesmaids were Maya, her sister, and 2 men she'd guided through their own professional journeys. As they exchanged vows with Lake Michigan as their witness, Both thought about the long road that had brought them here, not just to this moment, but to these selves, these people capable of love without losing themselves in it. "I promise," Harrison said, his voice steady, "to choose growth over comfort, us over fear, and tomorrow over yesterday, every single day for the rest of our lives." "I promise," Samara replied, "to trust the man you've become while never forgetting the journey that got you here, to build a love that makes us both braver, and to create a future worthy of every struggle that brought us together." In the audience, Dr. Chun wiped away tears, thinking about how rarely she got to witness such complete transformation. Maya cheered loudly, proud of her best friend's courage. And in the front row, Harrison's mother, who had flown in from Palm Beach, slowly learning to embrace the son she'd gotten back, smiled through her own complicated emotions. Change was possible. Love was stronger than fear. And sometimes, when two broken people were brave enough to heal together, they could create something so beautiful it justified every moment of pain that came before. As Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell kissed to seal their union, the Chicago wind carried their joy across the lake, toward a future bright with promise and anchored in the hardest-won truth of all. The best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing each other, every day, and doing the work to become worthy of that choice. What's your favorite love story about second chances and transformation? Drop a comment below and share how you've seen people change for love. I believe everyone deserves a redemption story, and I'd love to hear yours.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing as you can never imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.